Thank you, Jeff. I feel like oftentimes, I don't do this on purpose, but Jeff gets some of the harder, the harder readings. Believe it or not, it's hard. It's hard if you don't do it to like stand and read for like 3 or 4 minutes at a time. You know, I normally, again, I don't mean to keep apologizing, but the Ruth is interesting because it's so well written, but you can't really break up these stories. I feel like it does a disservice to these stories to break them up most of the time. So what I really want to do is, maybe you are listening to Ruth for the first time, but I want you to kind of picture as we go through this series that you're reading this story for the first time. You're hearing it for the first time. And I think there's something very compelling that's happening. Chapter 1, when you read it, you think it's about Naomi, right? Because she's the main character. She's the one that the most things are happening to. But if you scratch under the surface a little, you'll find that Ruth chapter 1 is really about Ruth. And then chapter 2, which our reading was today, it sounds like it's about Ruth. She's the one who, like, we're kind of following around. But again, if we scratch under the surface a little bit, we'll see that this chapter is actually about Boaz. And this is the man that we met for the first time just a few minutes ago. So it's Boaz that we're going to be spending the majority of our time talking about. And I think chapter 2 is pretty self-explanatory, but I just have this little recap that kind of will insert some of the theological things that we're looking for as we read the narrative. This is from Daniel Block. God's hidden hand is also at work in chapter 2. Leaving the house with the blessing of her mother-in-law, Ruth hoped to secure her and Naomi's maintenance for the winter by picking up stalks of grain dropped or left by harvesters. However, for this scheme to succeed, she admitted that she would need to find the field of a man who might be gracious to her. But what were the chances of Ruth the Moabite landing in the field of an Israelite who would treat her kindly? These were the dark days of the judges, when grace was in short supply and men tended to be particularly abusive to women. By sheer luck, she landed in the field of a man who was not only good to her, but also good for her and Naomi, for he was a close relative. So that's Ruth chapter 2 in a nutshell. But from the perspective of a sermon, like, how do we apply Ruth chapter 2? And you really, I feel like as a preacher, you only get 2 chances to preach this to a congregation. One way that it can be preached is through, like, the Torah, with lots of quotes from Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And I'm sure as much as you all would love to hear me preach about the intricacies of Jewish law, that's not what we're going to do today. We're going to approach this from like a character perspective, right? So through our journey through Ruth, most of these sermons you're going to hear take the narrative approach, because I think these characters are just so alive and they speak to us. So because of that, today's message is all about Boaz. So we'll start with Ruth. She goes out in search of food and work to provide for Naomi and herself, and she wanders into a field looking for work. And Israel had this custom called gleaning. Now, gleaning, this isn't an accurate way to describe it, but it's kind of like something today we would call a social welfare program. And I think that's an inaccurate way to describe it, because this program was not driven by the government. It was driven by God's law. It was in his law, and it was his expectation of the society. And this gleaning, it did not depend on tax revenue or compulsion. What it really depended on was people being faithful to God and loving and supporting what God thought they should do in their community. So how it worked is this: when the crops were being harvested, picture it's Super Bowl Sunday, so picture a football field. And that's a field of grain or a field of grapes. And basically the corners of the end zone and the white end line and the other corners of the end zone, you would leave all of that grain or crop, whatever it was, you'd leave it unpicked on purpose. And then people who were destitute would come into your fields behind your harvesters, and they would clean up that unpicked grain. Now, the people, interestingly enough, who would be the most destitute in this culture would be a foreigner or a widow. And we just happen to know Ruth is both of those things, right? She's a widow and a foreigner. And it's in that field where Ruth is gleaning, we meet Boaz for the first time. He comes into the field. He says to his workers, "The Lord be with you." And I think we learn a lot about Boaz by the way his workers replied to him. They say, "The Lord bless you." And you could be cynical here, and you could think, well, what exactly is a paid worker supposed to say to his boss when he says good morning, right? You could say. But don't be cynical, because I think this entire chapter is setting us up to see that Boaz is actually a godly, noble man. And so when that greeting time is over, Boaz, he sets his eyes on something peculiar. He sees Ruth out in the field working behind his servants, and he asks about her. And then the workers explain to him how she came from Moab with Naomi and how she'd been working in that field from the early morning. And then Boaz tells Ruth, these names are hard to say sometimes, in verses 8 and 9, that she's welcome to work there, and he's also ordered his men not to bother her. Now, that's, by bother her, we don't mean be the annoying guy at the coffee pot, no. Boaz, what he's telling his workers to do is not to harass her, not to abuse her, and not to pull anything of a sexual nature. Because remember, things like that have to be said. This is the time of the judges, and there was a lot of wicked men in the land. So Boaz wants to make this clear that he will not tolerate any of that. Now Boaz, he calls Ruth my daughter. So not only is this, it's a very affectionate term, particularly for some Moabite foreigner, but I also want you to know this speaks to their difference in age. Okay, so a lot of times, even our bulletin graphic, I was joking with Rebecca, who makes those beautiful graphics that it looks like two young people. Ruth was probably in her 20s, and Boaz was probably, he was older than me, probably. He had a lot of gray in his beard. He was probably close to what we would call retirement age. So this isn't Boaz is out in the field and he's scoping out this pretty young Moabite thing. That's kind of how it's presented sometimes. What he's really curious about with Ruth is he just wants to be a good dude. He wants to be a good Israelite. And working conditions under Boaz are good. He doesn't turn foreigners away. He's respected by his crew, and he doesn't tolerate what we would call today sexual harassment out in his fields. And in verses 14 and 17, we find out that he eats bread with his workers right out there in the field. Some translations will even talk about how he lets Ruth, ours says, dip the bread in the sour wine. I think the ESV says vinegar sauce, which sounds very good. So he eats with his workers out there. So we just think about working conditions today. Who would need a union if you could work for a man like Boaz? And it's true that Boaz, he is infatuated with Ruth a little bit. And this is curious. But it's not, his curiosity isn't something that would spark a cheap romance novel. He's just infatuated with this young beauty. And I don't think Boaz is also concerned with the power dynamic between men and women in Israel in this time. But what's interesting about Boaz here, he's so interested in Ruth because he's, again, going to do something that most people in that time would not do. Boaz is a righteous man. He loves God. He loves God's law. And he's the great-grandfather of King David, who is not yet born. And so in Boaz, the writer of Ruth, he's trying to show us what a king should look like. He's foreshadowing what a righteous man who rules well looks like. And so Boaz, he's not so much curious about Ruth as a person. He's more curious about her ethics, her motivations, and that she has come to Israel to be one of them. And Boaz told Ruth what his workers said about her. So his workers told Boaz about Ruth, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. So that's Ruth's story that he's curious in. And even if the people of Bethlehem didn't know it yet, Ruth has, remember in chapter 1, she has pledged her allegiance to Yahweh. So in Ruth's mind, she's already one of the Israelites. And I think it's precisely this that Boaz is attracted to and he's interested in. And so Boaz, he stands in stark contrast to the men of his time. Remember, this is the time of the judges, and everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. But now we see Boaz doing what he thinks is right in God's eyes. And like I said, we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of the Torah law. But if you actually start to study that and you read about what gleaning is and how welfare was done for foreigners, Boaz is actually breaking some of that law to go above and beyond the generosity that was bestowed on him in the law, right? So Proverbs 14:31 says, Those who oppress the poor insult their maker, but those who are kind to the needy honor him. So Boaz, when he first met Ruth, he said, "May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." So Boaz, he's not doing this just for charity. He's also doing this for God. Boaz is living out the scripture and living out the law in a way that is not box checking. He's living out the very spirit of God's law. Like the law is flowing through him out to Ruth in a way that is very kind, in a way that is very humanizing. So the law it's not functioning as some external force that's pressuring Boaz to act a certain way. He's doing what the law is supposed to do. It is supposed to make the world a better place. And Ruth might have Ruth ending up in Boaz's field, she might have viewed that as luck or chance. But I think Boaz here, he's viewing this as an act of God's ordination. So Boaz, he fills up her, it says her cloak or her sack with food and sends her home to Naomi with what our translation calls an ephah of barley, which is a lot of food. So picture a 6-gallon bucket of barley, bigger than a regular 5-gallon bucket. It probably weighs like 40, 45 pounds. That's how much gleaning that she did. And this is probably like a month's worth of food for Ruth and Naomi, probably more than that, actually. So it's far and above the amount that a destitute person could ever hope to be gleaned in a day's work. And I could go on and on about this, and I won't. But the fact remains that Boaz, how we're supposed to see him in this chapter is like typological, right? In a land that had no king, the people sure did have at least one noble man who loved people well at much expense to himself. Would Israel ever really need a king if there was a Boaz over every field? But there isn't a Boaz in every field, and that's the problem. So when Ruth comes home to Naomi with this month's worth of food, and she tells her what happened, Naomi's reaction, she says, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth says to Naomi, "The name of the man whom I work with today is Boaz." And then Naomi said to Ruth, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." So Naomi understands this blessing that came from Boaz to Ruth for what it actually was. This was actually a blessing from God through a man, not just to them, but also to Elimelech, who is the deceased part of this equation. So in this chapter, Boaz, what he does is he stands in the place of God in a small way to impact the world around him by not looking at the law as a restriction, but as permission to act like God when you actually can. So Boaz, he couldn't control all of Israel, but he could control one thing. He could control what happens in his field. Small acts of faithfulness, that's where God is found most of the time. Mother Teresa once said, "Be faithful in small things, because it is in them that your strength lies." And I think that that's so true. So when we look at Boaz's life and then we look at our lives, what should it make us think? Well, first of all, we have to be realistic about what we can control, right? Boaz wasn't a king, but he sure acted like a king who anyone would be blessed to live under. So it makes us think, what is actually under our control? Maybe our circle of influence is a few friends, our family, our workplace, our church. Maybe we have a lot of wealth, maybe we have a lot of influence, maybe we have no wealth, maybe we have no influence. But God gives us all something to rule over, and the Lord gives us all something to have influence over, even if it's just, like the widow's mite. So the question is, are we doing the bare minimum with what God has given us, or are we like Boaz where we go above and beyond? Are we bringing people closer to God by acting faithfully, or are we just doing the bare minimum? And we'll close here. Jesus told a parable about sums of money. He calls them talents, but this was money. And he gave different amounts of money to different servants to invest. Now, there wasn't equality in each amount of money that was given. So the servants, they went and they invested the money. They do what you do with money. But Christ had a harsh rebuke for the person who did nothing with the money. He called that person who did nothing wicked, lazy. So money, talent, influence, kindness, all these gifts that you have, whether they're physical or spiritual or emotional, these are not things to be hoarded. These are things God gave you to share with people. So we shouldn't worry about what God hasn't given us control over, right? Some of us will have more money than others. Some people will have more influence in others. But the question for all of us is, what are we doing with the things God actually gave us? Do we take what we have and be a blessing to other people? Now, Boaz, he didn't bankrupt himself to help Ruth, right? He could easily afford that extra grain. He didn't act recklessly. But he knew it was wrong to look at his field like other people were in maximizing every last drop of profit when instead he could bless a poor widow. So the difference between Boaz and his contemporaries is not only that he's aware of this fact, but he's motivated by it. So everything we learned about Boaz today up to this point speaks to he's not only a precursor to King David, but he's also a precursor to what Christ would be like. Now, Boaz says to Ruth, in a sense, come and glean in my field. Everything here is mine, but really it belongs to God. Jesus Christ says to each of us, if you love me, if you believe in me, even the kingdom becomes yours. So really the call for us is twofold. Ruth chapter 2, twofold. The first call is that in your circle, in your family, in your church, in your community, go out and be a Boaz. Don't follow the letter of the law. Be filled with God's Spirit and God's love and God's righteousness. And the second call for us is to see Christ's love in ordinary actions, through ordinary people in the world, just like Boaz was doing. People who do small actions, people who do what is right, people who do what is not comfortable. Those are the people who are really righteous. So Boaz, what he's doing, he's lifting our eyes from the horizon, from what he's done with Ruth, and he lifts our eyes toward Christ, and Boaz lifts our eyes toward heaven. Do you see how Ruth chapter 2 is really like a picture of heaven? Just like Ruth needed food, we all need food. We need spiritual food. And someday all of us, we're going to glean in the fields of heaven, and not just the corners of those fields, because there's going to be abundance there. And just like Ruth in that field, in heaven there will be safety and protection from all kinds of evil. And like Ruth and Boaz in that field, when we're taking our lunch break and we're sitting there eating our bread, the kingdom of heaven is going to come, and he's going to eat bread with us because love and righteousness are there, and we'll be safe under the wings of our God. Amen.